Okay, so far we've talked about the various sources of evidence that one might have for sentences that might serve as premises of arguments. We then zoomed in on one particular form of evidence, namely testimonial evidence, which is particularly ubiquitous and also sometimes particularly problematic. Now, finally, we're going to talk about one sort of sentence that might and often does form a premise of an argument that is, maybe particularly worth thinking about in terms of the sorts of evidence that we might acquire for it, or how we might think about whether it's true or false, and that's the generalization. So a sentence or premise might be a generalization, and we need to think a bit more carefully about under what circumstances generalizations are true or false. So many arguments employ generalizations. So a simple example would be the following argument: all birds have feathers, puffins are birds, therefore puffins have feathers. The blue sentences are the premises, the red sentence is the conclusion. And premise one is fairly clearly a generalization because it includes the word all. So it's saying something's generally true, all birds. It's generally true that birds have feathers. It's always true, in fact, that birds have feathers. So all birds have feathers is a generalization. It's saying something that's true in general of birds. And in fact, this is known as a universal generalization because it's actually saying that something kind of fairly extreme, namely that every bird has feathers. It's universally true of birds that they have feathers. So it's known as a universal generalization. Now, in virtue of this word all, it's fairly clear that all birds have feathers is a universal generalization. But it's worth noting that there are other ways of expressing universal generalizations that don't involve the word all. And this is, something that we find generally when analysing arguments, that there are often multiple ways of expressing the same meaning. And so it is with universal generalizations. So all birds have feathers. It's basically the same thing as saying every bird has feathers. So 2 there on the slide is saying something universal about birds. They all have feathers. Universal generalizations can sometimes also be expressed negatively. So if we consider 3 on the slide, no birds are featherless. It's expressed negatively. It has the word no in, but it's basically saying the same thing. It's if no birds are featherless, then it seems obvious that we must be saying that every bird has feathers. So actually 3 is equivalent to 1 and 2, even though it's expressed negatively. And sometimes you'll find generalizations, including universal generalizations, that don't include words like all that tip us off to the fact that they're generalizations. So we've got to think a bit more carefully. So number 4, birds have feathers. It doesn't include a word like all or every or no or always or everywhere. These sorts of words that might clue us off to the fact that we're dealing with a universal generalization. But nevertheless, on reflection, it seems to be telling us something that's universally true about birds, namely that they have feathers. It doesn't qualify in any way. It says birds have feathers. So presumably the assertion being made is that this is true of all birds, that they have feathers. Sometimes we have to reflect a bit on sentences to figure out exactly what they're telling us, and sometimes they may be clearer in their meaning than others. So we might find one particularly clear, maybe 4 we have to think about a bit more. And sometimes we might want to translate an argument that we find written or spoken somewhere into a sort of more canonical or universal form, and so we might end up translating a sentence like 4 into a sentence like 1, which on reflection has the same meaning. Now, there are sorts of generalizations besides universal generalizations, and one important class of generalization is a statistical generalization. So these, there are various sorts of statistical generalization, and it's 1 through 5 are examples. So, well, particularly 1 through 4, we might quibble about 5, but I'll return to that in a minute. So 1 says 90% of people are right-handed. That's statistical. It's fairly precise, right? So it gives us a precise percentage or a precise statistic, 90%. 2, most people are right-handed. That's less precise. Doesn't give us a specific number. By saying most, it probably implies that more than 50%, so most seems to imply more than 50%, so more than half people are right-handed. 3 again is not precise, and in a sense is even less specific than 2. It just says many people are right-handed, and presumably many people could be right-handed even if the number or the statistic is less than half, right? So it could just be a significant minority, and that would still qualify as many. Some people are right-handed is even less committal, right? It's just some, I guess, doesn't even imply that it's a significant minority. It could even be a small minority. And maybe at the other extreme, at least one person is right-handed. That's very uncommittal, right? So it's telling us, okay, yeah, there's at least one person that's right-handed, but not going to tell you anything more about how many people are right-handed. Sometimes sentences like 5 that say at least one are known as existential generalizations. So the reason is they're telling us that something exists, namely a right-handed person in this case. There is at least one, so there exists at least one. There exists a right-handed person. We'll return to the notion of an existential generalization or an existentially quantified statement in a moment. As just like universal generalizations, statistical generalizations are often appealed to in arguments. So consider something like the following: the overwhelming majority of sapphires mined in Australia are blue. Therefore, we may assume the next sapphire mined in Australia will be blue. Now, the premise in blue doesn't deductively entail the conclusion in red. So even if the premise is true, it's possible that the conclusion should be false. So even though the overwhelming majority of sapphires mined in Australia are blue, it seems possible that the next sapphire should be non-blue, just happen to be a different colour. And this is, often the fact that an argument is non-deductive is marked by the person making it in the conclusion, right? So here I've said in brackets, we may assume, therefore we may assume, or you might see something like, therefore probably the next sapphire mined in Australia will be blue. So this is giving us a clue that the person making the argument doesn't take it to be a case where the conclusion is deductively entailed, or in other words, guaranteed by the premises, but just it's made probable by the premises. Such arguments are sometimes called inductive arguments as opposed to deductive arguments, where the premises do guarantee the conclusion. Okay, so let's think a bit about evidence for generalizations. So, okay, some universal generalizations might just be definitional truths or mathematical truths. So they might be self-evident, to return to the categorization of reasons for believing premises that we mentioned in the first part of this lecture. So for instance, all triangles have three sides. That's a universal generalization, but it also seems to be true by definition, just by definition of what a triangle is. But many are not, right? So many universal generalizations are not simply true by definition. So perhaps an example is all copper conducts electricity. It doesn't seem that that's true by the definition of copper. And there's kind of a problem with proving universal generalizations where they're not simply definitional truths, right? There seems to be a challenge, right? So it's a very strong claim. It's a claim, it's a universal claim. It's a claim about everything of a certain sort, right? So all copper conducts electricity. So you might wonder, and philosophers have wondered, how can we know that such sentences are true unless we've examined every instance? So unless we've tested every sample of copper and found that it conducts electricity, how can we know that all copper conducts electricity? So it might seem that there's a particular problem associated with acquiring a decent amount of evidence, enough to believe a universal generalization. And in philosophy, this is sometimes known as the problem of induction, right? And this actually relates to the fact that arguments where the premises don't conclusively establish the conclusion are called inductive arguments, right? And the thought here is that suppose we actually wanted to prove that all copper conducts electricity. Suppose we wanted to prove that on the basis of an argument. Well, okay, so maybe we could have an argument like, well, copper sample 1 conducts electricity, copper sample 2 conducts electricity, copper sample 3 conducts electricity, and so on for some high number. Therefore, all copper conducts electricity, right? So we might have good reason to believe that copper sample 1, 2, 3, 1,000 conducted electricity. Maybe we tested 1,000 pieces and found that they all conducted electricity. But still, this doesn't seem to absolutely guarantee the conclusion that all copper conducts electricity. So the premises of such an argument don't guarantee the conclusion. So it's an inductive argument, not a deductive one. And you might wonder whether we could ever truly know that all copper conducts electricity unless we've tested every single sample that exists, and unless we know there are no more samples and we've tested every one that exists. So there's a sort of challenge associated with knowing them. So can we know them? Well, perhaps we can know these universal generalizations via something known as inference to the best explanation, sometimes abbreviated IBE. So you might think, well, okay, we've got, now I don't know how many we've tested, but maybe we've tested 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, 1 million samples of copper and found that they all conduct electricity. Can we reasonably infer that all copper conducts electricity? Well, one way of making progress might be thinking about why we found that every sample of copper we've ever tested conducts electricity. So we can think maybe of two hypotheses about why all copper so far tested conducts electricity. So first hypothesis, coincidentally, we've only tested those bits of copper that happen to conduct electricity. So the hypothesis is, yeah, maybe there are bits of copper that conduct electricity and bits of copper that don't conduct electricity, but by coincidence, the ones we've tested all just happen to be among those that conduct electricity. Hypothesis B would be, actually, we have selected bits of copper more or less randomly from all the copper samples there are. And the reason that all of these randomly selected bits of copper conduct electricity is that, in fact, all copper conducts electricity. And maybe that's just because of the atomic structure of copper. Now, arguably, hypothesis B is the better explanation of our empirical results. It's the better explanation of why all the pieces of copper we've tested so far conduct electricity. So we might infer that it's correct. We might think, well, hypothesis B better explains what we've observed, and we ought to infer the truth of the best explanation. So we infer that all copper conducts electricity. So this is one sort of possible solution to the problem of induction, the problem of how we can know that universal generalizations are true, at least sometimes. But notice that inference of the best explanation is itself a form of non-deductive reasoning. So it seems that just because something's the best explanation doesn't absolutely guarantee that it's true. But maybe it makes it more probable or something like that. But this is a kind of debate in the philosophy of science, so it's somewhat controversial. But it seems like one avenue we might go down if we're interested in vindicating our knowledge of universal generalizations that aren't definitional truths. Okay, so at least we've seen there are some sort of philosophical and practical challenges associated with demonstrating universal generalizations to be true, or at least becoming convinced of their truth or having knowledge of their truth. By contrast, it seems in principle relatively easy to prove that a universal generalization is false. We might think to prove a universal generalization is true, well, maybe it doesn't require us to look at every instance. Maybe we don't need to test absolutely every sample of copper in existence. But probably we've got to sample a great number in order to have good grounds for accepting it. Whereas by contrast, in order to prove the universal generalization is false, we just need to find one contrary instance, right? So consider a claim like all sapphires are blue. All that would be needed in order to show it's false is to find a sapphire that's not blue. Just one sapphire that's not blue will do. So one green sapphire falsifies the claim that all sapphires are blue. And here's where we'll mention existential generalizations again, right? So proving a universal generalization, like all sapphires are blue and false, is basically the same as proving a corresponding existential generalization is true, namely the existential generalization, at least one sapphire is not blue. So these at least one claims are what are known as existential generalizations. Okay, so there are some sort of interesting challenges when thinking about universal generalizations. What about statistical generalizations? How easy they are to prove or to come to have knowledge of depends, at least in parts, on their precision. Generally, the more precise a statistical generalization is, the more difficult it is to prove. Whereas the vaguer ones are more easy to prove, more easy to come to have knowledge of, right? So 90% of people are right-handed. That's very precise, it gives a precise statistic. So we need to be able to back up that precise statistic if we were to believe that with any confidence, right? So that seems like we'd have to really survey the entire population in order to discover that that's the correct statistic. Whereas most people are right-handed. Well, I guess as soon as we've if the population is 10 million, then as soon as we've found 5 million and one people who are right-handed, then we can quit work and go home for the day, because we've already established that most are right-handed. If we're not bothered about the precise statistic in the whole population, then that's all we need to do. And many people are right-handed is presumably even easier, right? So maybe we don't even need to look at half the population in order to know that many are right-handed. And certainly some are right-handed, or at least one is right-handed, or seem to be even easier still to establish. So the kind of moral here is that, well, many arguments involve generalizations as premises, sometimes universal generalizations, sometimes statistical generalizations. And there are challenges associated with acquiring evidence or establishing these generalizations. Some sorts of generalization are harder to establish than others. Universal generalizations might count as relatively hard. Precise statistical generalizations are also quite hard, whereas more vague statistical generalizations might be relatively easier. So this gives us a flavor of how much work we have to do in order to establish the truth of the premises of the argument we're dealing with. And it might be that sometimes a premise is stronger or more precise than it actually needs to be, right? So, for instance, a premise might be that 90% of people are right-handed, therefore probably Shakespeare was right-handed, or therefore more likely than not Shakespeare was right-handed. You might think, well, okay, actually the premise is stronger and therefore harder to prove than we actually need for that argument. You might think that we could get by merely with the premise that most people are right-handed. And so you might think, well, actually, we need to establish something less than the premise that's given in order to establish the likelihood of the conclusion. Okay, so we'll think more about all these topics as the semester progresses, but that's plenty to be going on with for now. So goodbye, and I'll hopefully see you all in person soon.